Well, thank you, Nello Rossi, for having dealt with this issue in such an exhaustive manner.
In the language of Israeli and Palestinian and international activists, apartheid is a language which is well known since President Carter was attacked because of his rallying with Israel. You gave us some very interesting insight in that, because this is something that we should clearly understand and in a more articulate manner. So you gave us some very interesting hints as to what we can do to pursue this effort. Well, we need intellectual clarity, and you have helped us a great deal along these lines. I'd like to call upon Fausto Gianelli from the Democratic Jurists. Thank you for your invitation and the opportunity have been given today. I've taken note of what was said during the morning and in the afternoon, because I've had the opportunity of taking notes about these very interesting presentations, and I've jotted down a few questions which I'd like to elaborate upon as a contribution to the debate, both in line with what I heard this morning and in the afternoon. I sort of asked myself, what is it that we can do faced with the problem of the unsolved problem of the Palestinian-Israeli question, which we have tried to look at from within the Israeli society, before asking ourselves how the Israeli state acts in contact with the Palestinian reality in the occupied territories. I would take as a starting point what Avraham Berg said. He said, well, we've got to take as a starting point the reality, the factual reality, the two-state solution, which is being over and over mentioned as a mantra, which is the logical solution, and which is even mentioned in UN resolutions with sort of hypothetical green line. Well, this sort of solution whereby you would divide the two states, Israel and Palestine, by means of a green line. Well, the two states do not exist now, but in the future there might be sort of a future that we will have to build ourselves, which is a transitional future, this transitional phase that we are willing to accept, considering that there might be a final sort of step towards the establishment of the two states that can coexist peacefully. I think that the time has basically done away with such a possibility. We have to be very realistic in our approach. A two-state solution, which was never really advocated within Israel, is less and less feasible today. As we were discussing sort of about the peace process, which Avraham Berg defined as a mental state, the solid facts on the ground were being changed to make it impossible and not. So if that solution is not possible, then we will have to look at it, an alternative solution, as a single state where the two peoples, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, might coexist peacefully. And I'd like to take up this suggestion, which is of great interest and provides a new paradigm. But there is a problem which is connected with this solution. Well, this single state already exists. You have a situation of a state that controls a territory, has a military political sovereignty on it, but this state, which exists today and will continue to exist for a long time, it's a state that has some specific traits and characteristics with two areas of democracy, diversified democracy, full democracy within Israel. And we'll see that that is not entirely true. some claim this is what happens within Israel. You have this twofold petition. Well, in Israel, you have a serene democracy, which is the paradise of human rights. Well, and then there is another sort of situation where sort of Israel is a different sort of democracy, quote unquote. So we have two spheres of democracy on the territory of Israel, which are not clearly explained. And there is a position which was advocated by some important leading Israeli jurists, the president of the Supreme Court. Well, it's something which is not convincing to me. We have Israeli citizens, non-Jewish Israeli citizens that find themselves in a very different situation. So within Israel, we have a different kind of democracy. I've attended a meeting convened by Gianelli and said we have three kinds of democratic regime: full democracy for the Jewish citizens, and reduced democracy for non-Jewish citizens of Israel, and a regime of military occupation in the West Bank. These three spheres of democracy raise a major problem in that the situation tends to further grow. Mention was made earlier on by education and culture. And I'd like to sort of link this up with what Rivlin, the head of the Israeli state, has said. I'm worried because there are 4 tribes coexisting in Israel. On the basis of the educational system, you have 20% Arab schools, then lay Jews, Orthodox Jews, and religious Jews. These 4 tribes do not communicate with each other, do not enter into a dialogue. They don't have the sort of the service, the military service as a common ground, because the ultra-Orthodox Jews do not serve in the army. So this is a real problem. So when we talk about Israel as a single state, that does not correspond to the truth, to the reality on the ground. So I'd like to focus on one problem, which is the number 1 problem in my view, and it's like the original sin. We sort of take for granted that Israel was a democratic state and a Jewish state. This is something which is being accepted in Israel, but we, as we look at it from outside, we would never accept it. Who would accept it? France defines itself as a democratic and Christian state, or Italy would do the same. So to define the Israeli state as a democratic and a Jewish state raises a number of problems, which we would look into, we would have to look into more comprehensively. To think that you are a Jewish and democratic state, and thinking that the Jewish identity is a constituent element of the state is wrong, because you would have people that that somehow looks like a beginning of apartheid. And then there is a second point whereby Israel claims that is in a country which is operating under emergency situation. Since it was established, Israel felt that they were sort of living in an emergency situation, and Israel signed some international conventions, such as the Pact for Civil and Political Rights in 1966. It signs this pact, but then requests for derogation, indicating that it will suspend its implementation because Israel lives in a state, in an emergency state, so it doesn't implement this Convention on Fundamental Political and Human Rights. So the question is not so much that Israel lives in a state of emergency, but it claims that it is an exceptional state, and therefore claims it should operate under exceptional conditions. people say, why schools do create this kind of young people that feel that way. But there was a poll that was published by the Israeli papers. In a poll which was undertaken in Israel, most Israeli Jews felt that they were sort of in favor of Israeli Jews as opposed to Arab Jews, so based on religious and ethnic identity. This was higher in the more orthodox Haredim that were in favor of expelling non-Jewish Israeli citizens. And then there was another sort of poll, which was really appalling when it comes to the results of the poll. Well, I think we have to consider very carefully these results. Now, if most Jews, 59% says that they would be in favor of the fact that it be a legal preference for a positive discrimination for Jews, if 49% says that the government has got to consider first Jewish citizens and non-Jewish citizens, we should ask ourselves, where do we live? Well, Gideon Levi says, what has become of Israel as a state? I would ask rather a different question. What was the definition that Israel gave of its state? Is there a sort of a conflict when you say that Israel is a democratic state that belongs to all its citizens and allows for equal representation and political dignity to all its citizens, and a state which defines itself as a Jewish state, which is clearly based on principles of identity, granting more rights to its own citizens? And we're still talking about Israel itself rather than the West Bank or Gaza. So this is a fundamental different political rights between Jews and non-Jews. And this discrimination that jurist said is not a discrimination against Israeli Arabs, but to favor Israeli Jews. So, and this is the wrong way of considering the question. At this stage, we do have to face a key problem. When we envisage sort of a single state with two nations, we'll have to consider whether this state will continue to define itself as a Jewish state, and we should ask ourselves what are the rights that will be granted to people that are not Jewish and live in that state. So we have to ensure that there is a proper protection of individual fundamental rights. So the discrimination does raise a problem in terms of how do we look at the Israeli state. And this raises a problem for us as well, because the rights are interconnected all over the world. You can't have a medical experiment which is confined to a single laboratory. The elimination of rights under the guise of legal justifications have a characteristics. They may be confined to one area. Administrative detention, which was mentioned by Nella Rossi, has been largely applied elsewhere. So this idea of a society which is based on military control, discrimination on the basis of ethnic or religious principles are notions and concepts that will be exported elsewhere in the world. And Israel appears as a paradigm of a democracy which is at war. So in the future we might turn out to be democracies which are at war and threatened. Civic militarism, is it compatible with democracy? The Romans that invented the modern law felt that the armies should be outside should camp outside the civil boundaries of the cities. So they made a distinction between the civilian area and the military area. But now Israel makes this an important characteristic in terms of identity. You have people that sort of their specific impact on the life of citizens as a result of this. So we should ask ourselves what sort of a democracy we have in mind when it comes to Israel and other countries. For too long have we considered that democracy is a place where the democratically elected majority decides everything. So Norberto Bobbio used to say, and he was a leading democratic jurist, democracy is not a system where majorities are the ones that make the decision, but where minorities are guaranteed. Israel is the place where the Jewish majority makes the decision. What would happen if in Italy we were to decide that a minority would have fewer rights? It would no longer be a democracy. Democracy is a system which protects the rights of minorities. I think that this raises a problem in terms of the actual authentic democracy of the Israeli society. The 20% of Israel, which is a minority and which is excluded from politics and must remain a minority because it's not a Jewish part of the population, has to do with how we define democracy in the new millennium. Legal universalism is not something confined to Israel, but the rules might be sort of applied elsewhere. So we would convert the democracy as Plato would say, that democracy is demo, people, and then power. So, and kratos is violence. Democracy is the violence of the majority which prevails on the minority. And he felt that there was an appalling system. We had for years considered substantial democracy as a democracy which would consider first and foremost the rights of the minorities. If instead it's the democracy only provides for a minor role for the minorities, we track back with respect to our own view of democracy. So it's most urgent for us to discuss about democracy in Israel, but elsewhere as well, because I think that democracy is threatened in Europe, in Italy, elsewhere as well. When we see that minorities are not integrated, there is a risk of conflict which might break out. I'd like to close with a quote from a liberal democratic jurist, Alan Dershowitz, a well-known lawyer, who said, as a liberal, I feel that the future of democracy, which is threatened by terrorism and war, is a democracy which rethinks itself, must accept the possibility of torture. He says he's in favor of torture for the sake of the protection of democratic majorities. And he comes up with a number of paradoxical ideas which somehow appalls us. We should take democracy of Israel, which is at war and is fighting against terrorism, because this is a possible future. I think this is a possible, very negative future, which we might have to grapple with.